All right, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome back to Mending the Sacred Hoop TA's Key Issues and Promising Practices, our webinar series that we started back in April and we are continuing through November, which is crazily just around the corner here. Today we have Michael Kamal of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, who's going to be talking to us about using the Blue campaign in tribal communities. So he's standing by to join us shortly. But before that, just a few things I want to cover. Our next session is with Leslie Hagan of the U.S. Department of Justice National Indian Country Training Initiative. And she's going to talk to us about developing a collaborative response to violence against women in Indian country. So be sure to catch that one on September 7th. Again, crazy that September is just around the corner, but well enough it is. So please join us for that session as well. It's sure to be filled with all kinds of wonderful knowledge and information for all of us. And if you haven't yet signed up for that one, you can go ahead and go to Mending the Sacred Hoops website at mshoop.org. Under the OVW Tribal Events tab, you can register there. Also look for it in your inbox if you haven't already received it. There should be another one coming through soon. Housekeeping items for today. So we are using Zoom webinar, and because of that, your video is disabled as your audio is also turned off right now. So if you do have a question, you have a couple options for that. You can use the Q&A function, type in your questions as they come up, and I can interrupt Michael as he's speaking if he misses the question and get him to address it as quickly as possible, given the situation, given where he's at in his presentation. Alternatively, you can raise your hand using that little raise hand emoji, and I can unmute you at that point and you can just verbally speak your question. Some people are more comfortable doing it that way. Whatever works for you works for us as well, but please feel free, ask those questions as they come up. That is such a good way to get an engaging session going and get more and more information flowing. If you do have any technical issues today, you can email Holly Oden. She is standing by, so you can either email her or you can directly chat her in the chat function within Zoom. So either way, she is there to help you if you have any technical issues that may arise. Again, super excited to have you all here. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share and let Michael jump in, introduce himself, and get started.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this webinar series. Really appreciative of your organization. Jill and Holly, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here, play this from the beginning. So as Jill mentioned, my name is Michael Kamal, and I work at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security on our anti-human trafficking initiative, which is the DHS Blue campaign. Some of you may be familiar, but we are the national public awareness campaign for the Department of Homeland Security's efforts to combat human trafficking. So I will be covering a couple different topics here. Here is the agenda. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to type those in the question, and I'd be happy to answer them throughout the presentation and also at the end. Today, I will be covering information about the Blue campaign. What is human trafficking? I like to provide a base level of information for all my webinars to dispel some myths and misconceptions. I'll be talking about specific content that Blue campaign has tailored for tribal communities, as well as some of our tribal community trainings, our advertising efforts, and what to do if you see human trafficking or if you suspect it going on in your daily lives. And this is a really great presentation. We did tailor it specifically for this audience, so I hope you enjoy it. And with that, I will move along. As I mentioned earlier, the Blue campaign is a national public awareness campaign designed to educate the public, law enforcement, and other partners on how to recognize and report human trafficking. And we work across the Department of Homeland Security. DHS is a massive agency, and we have several components that work to combat this crime. The Blue campaign works across those different components to create awareness training and materials tailored for specific target audiences. And I'll get into a little bit of that down the line here. So the Blue campaign, we have two major outcomes, so to speak, strategic outcomes, and they're aligned with the 4P model. The 4Ps are protection, prevention, partnerships, and prosecution. And at Blue campaign, we look at these two main ones here, protection and prevention. And under the protection bucket, we focus on increasing law enforcement use of a trauma-informed approach, ensuring that victims of human trafficking are treated as such and not re-victimized through different practices. And then the second outcome under protection is educating the public and industry on how to recognize and report human trafficking. And that outcome number two is probably the Blue campaign's most long-standing outcome. It hasn't really changed since we were created in 2010. But since then, so much has changed, and we expanded our strategic outcomes to also include prevention, which talks about stopping human trafficking before it occurs, whether that is decreasing victimization within vulnerable communities or deterring criminal activity, trying to educate people on what the consequences are so that they are less inclined to engage in it or become a trafficker. Definitely challenging outcomes, but we're not afraid to tackle it. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the specific things that we do. So I had mentioned this before, the Blue campaign was created in 2010. A lot has happened since there in the anti-trafficking world. Different laws requiring training. 20 years ago, human trafficking was not the same thing. It was the same thing in the sense of the crime, but people didn't really understand what it was back then. A lot of times, law enforcement and different members of the public conflated prostitution with human sex trafficking. And of course, now we know that those are two very different things. Of course, sex trafficking is one that it's involuntary. And so I'm not going to go over every piece of legislation here, but I will highlight a few. Specifically in 2018, the Blue Campaign Authorization Act of 2017 became law. So in 2010, we were created as a special initiative by the secretary at the time. In 2018, we were authorized officially, and we became an official program within the department, meaning that we have full-time staff now dedicated towards this mission. Before, we were operating on details assignments, so people would come in, work for a couple months, and then rotate out. And now I'm pleased to announce that we have full-time staff, which is critically important to, achieving those long-term outcomes I talked about before, and ensuring that that we focus on combating human trafficking the best we can. In 2020, we celebrated our 10th anniversary, which we're very excited about. I talked about this earlier, but DHS is massive. We have so many different components within our purview. Up here, you'll see a few. You'll see the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. That is DHS, and they are in a unique position to look out for human trafficking after natural disasters. We have the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which trains all federal law enforcement agents on human trafficking awareness, and they also have some specific resources for state and local law enforcement. And of course, down here, you'll see our office, which is just one piece of the puzzle. But on the top left here, you'll see Homeland Security Investigations, and they are a very critical piece of DHS's efforts because they investigate the crime of human trafficking, among other crimes. They hold traffickers accountable, and they've also got a robust victim assistance program where they can assist victims and get them access to the resources that they need so that they can be recovered and get out of their situation. And it is definitely, these cases can be very complex, and they do some great work. So one very exciting announcement is that last January, DHS announced the Center for Countering Human Trafficking. And up here, you can see the seal for that new center. It's comprised of all of these agencies you see up here, focused on a unified effort towards combating human trafficking from a departmental level. So it's not just Blue Campaign, it's not just Homeland Security Investigations. Every DHS agency has a role to play and is collaborating on a unified mission towards addressing this crime. And the other thing I'll note here is that DHS employs a victim-centered and trauma-informed approach with just about everything we do when it comes to human trafficking. And what that means is placing equal value on the stabilization of victims as we do on the prosecution and investigation of traffickers. It is extremely important to hold traffickers accountable, but one of the what's even more important is to make sure that victims are out of that situation and have access to available resources such as NGOs and support centers and whatnot. So the Blue Lightning Initiative is one of the programs that I work on. This is a specific initiative tailored for the aviation industry. So we partner with airports, airlines. Sorry about that. Current slide. We partner with airports, airlines, basically anyone in the aviation industry who's willing to train frontline staff on what to look out for. It is a formal partnership, so it does require an MOU with DHS, and we also partner with the U.S. Department of Transportation on this and U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So this is, again, BOI, it's my specific portfolio. It's just one example of some of the stuff that Blue Campaign does. We train aviation personnel on the indicators to look out for in an aviation setting and how to report their suspicions to federal law enforcement. We have over 70 partners. That includes airlines, airports, private jet companies, and we've trained over 100,000 personnel in the aviation industry. And when I talk about aviation, I do want to caveat that with, we have confirmed cases of human trafficking occurring not just in major cities, but also in small rural towns and also on tribal reservations. So we focus on training not just big city airports, but also small airports and small airlines. People can be in a really good position to see some of this stuff happening, and we want to do our best to train those folks. This engagement, a couple of years ago, I actually traveled to the Miami International Airport, and I trained over 100 airport staff and aviation personnel. The survey feedback was very positive, as you can see here. And after this meeting, we ended up securing a full-time partnership with the Miami Airport. Right now we're sitting at over 30 airports involved in this program, which is excellent. So I did talk a little bit about Blue Campaign, what we do to combat human trafficking, some of the resources that we have. One thing I didn't mention is that the Blue Campaign ships out our products, our printed awareness posters, cards, toolkits, nationwide to stakeholders across the world, across the US. So organizations, individuals can order our materials free of charge, and we can actually ship those materials out to you directly to your location. And I'd be happy to share the link with that after this webinar. So I will now talk about human trafficking. What is human trafficking? So, you see human trafficking often portrayed in the media and news as an extreme form of violence that only happens overseas. And I'm here to kind of dispel some of those myths. So human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to solicit someone to perform commercial sex act or some form of labor. Up here, you can see the legal definition. It includes sex trafficking and forced labor. And one very important thing to note is that anyone under the age of 18 engaged in commercial sex is a victim of human trafficking, regardless of whether there are elements of force, fraud, or coercion. It's a federal crime, so it doesn't matter where you are. If you're a minor under the age of 18, you legally cannot consent to sex. So therefore, you're a victim of human trafficking if that's the case. And that's something very important to note and is very helpful for DHS when they conduct investigations. So one thing I will talk about as well here is the difference between human smuggling and human trafficking. And we often hear these terms used interchangeably, but they're actually very different terms. So human smuggling is the crime against the border. It does require movement and it requires voluntary participation. Trafficking, on the other hand, is a crime against a person. It's exploitation-based and no border crossing is required. The key piece here is exploitation and involuntary. So someone, despite some misconceptions, you actually don't even need to be transported anywhere to be a human trafficking victim. Victims of human trafficking can be exploited within their own home, within their own community, within their own town. without it ever crossing any state or international lines. So I will caveat that with saying that some situations of human smuggling can turn into human trafficking. So let's say someone pays for their way to get across the US into our country illegally. And once they're here, they're somewhat free to go about their business, although albeit they're undocumented. What can happen oftentimes with foreign nationals is once they get here, the person that facilitated them to come here takes away their travel documents, their visa, their passport, takes away all their money, their possessions, and provides them with the bare minimum to survive. They say, if you don't work for me, if you don't have sex with these people, I'll report you to ICE, we'll get you deported, and I'll refer you to law enforcement. And they use threats, coercion, threats of violence, threats of harm to get someone into a human trafficking situation. And that does happen. And so that's one example of how human smuggling can turn into human trafficking. The key is the voluntary and involuntary piece there. So I talked a little bit about some myths already, but I really love this slide because it outlines probably the most common things that we hear at Blue Campaign. The first is that it doesn't happen in the United States. This is not true. Human trafficking happens in all 50 states, US territories, and US territories. Like I mentioned earlier, it happens in big cities, in suburbs, rural towns, and on tribal lands. I really like to point this out because it's a misconception, and domestic human trafficking is happening, and it's definitely happening a lot. A lot of people are being exploited, but there are several resources available to victims. Another myth here is that victims are only foreign-born individuals and those who are poor. And the truth is that victims can really be anyone. They can be any age, race, gender, nationality, immigration, or socioeconomic group. They're not only poor, they're not only women and children, and they're not only foreign-born. Those are pieces that can lead to more vulnerabilities. However, we've encountered survivors and victims who were wealthy, middle class, and ended up exploited into labor trafficking situations, or even worse, their children in labor and sex trafficking situations. And that leads me to my next one here, which is that victims will attempt to seek help in public. I definitely believed in this myth before I started working on human trafficking. It's a misconception that many victims will, go to the nearest law enforcement official and get themselves out of that terrible situation. But the truth is often very tragic, in that victims are often afraid to seek help because of threats from their trafficker. And I don't just mean threats to the victim themselves, I also mean threats to the victim's family and loved ones. Sometimes they threaten the children, they threaten people they love. They say, if you go to law enforcement, I'll force your family to be in the same situation that you're in. And when you add factors like that into play, it definitely makes a lot of sense why some of these victims are hesitant to get help. Because if they get help and they're unsuccessful, they might be in even more trouble, and they get caught from their trafficker, they might be in even more trouble. They might get beatings, might get put to work even more. And so there's a lot of variables at play. Not just threats from trafficker, physical threats, but also psychological. Sometimes these trafficking situations start off as what appears to be a genuine boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, and then it ends up into sex trafficking. And oftentimes traffickers will target those who are vulnerable and exploit them in that way. So just a couple of things to consider as you listen to my presentation here. Talked about this already, but human trafficking is also labor trafficking, not just sex trafficking. That includes domestic servitude, which is kind of like a nanny situation where, and these are suburban towns where this can happen. Things you wouldn't even think to consider with human trafficking. Folks forced to sleep on the floor, not paid what they're worth, don't have any, they're forced to work over the hours they're scheduled for. These are just a couple indicators and examples of how human trafficking can happen when it comes to labor trafficking. But it's not just domestic servitude, it's also construction, agriculture, strip malls. There's a whole bunch of different sectors in which labor trafficking is impacted, and it's important to be aware of some of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how traffickers operate, but I do want to pause very quickly and see if there are any questions so far. I don't see any questions in the Q&A portion, but I'll give it half a minute here. Okay, great. Well, traffickers can operate in many different ways. Sometimes traffickers are individuals. Sometimes they're a part of larger criminal organizations. And they often prey on individuals, like I mentioned earlier, who are vulnerable or those who have few or no social support systems. Traffickers can be any age, gender, race. To victims, they can be pimps, or like I mentioned earlier, a romantic partner. They can be employers, community leaders, or people of prominence. And believe it or not, they can also be family members, friends, or strangers. Traffickers have increasingly turned to the internet to identify and lure victims, but they do still utilize physical meeting spaces for recruitment as well. Some examples of how traffickers may reach victims include on popular meeting places. Up here, you can see social media, online, and dating apps. And this is a huge key piece here for what's been going on, especially with COVID, with more people on their phones. Traffickers often use the internet to reach victims because they can take advantage of personal information shared online to exploit perceived hardships or insecurities to gain trust. These traffickers are, oftentimes they're not dumb, they're very smart. They know how to groom and target those who are most vulnerable. Peer-to-peer recruitment is also another piece here. Whenever there are areas where a lot of young people are in one place, it can create opportunities for traffickers to coerce their victims into recruiting their peers. Victims that are made to recruit other victims are typically called bottoms. And so that's, you may have heard of this term before, but oftentimes a bottom is someone who is a victim themselves, but then ends up turning into, in a way, a trafficker who's recruiting other women or men to participate in the sex or labor trafficking on behalf of the main trafficker. And this was the case. If you've ever seen the Jeffrey Epstein docuseries, there was a lot of the victims ended up becoming bottoms and recruiting other young females to join the sex trafficking operation. And it doesn't just happen in that scenario, it actually happens in many sex trafficking scenarios. Deceptive offers of employment or romantic relationships. I'm going to touch a little on this. Traffickers can take advantage of the economic instability by offering people jobs such as modeling that may seem too good to be true. Entering romantic relationships or providing emotional support are also common ways for traffickers to control and manipulate victims. Again, super terrible, but these are the things that they're doing. They also take advantage of financial instability. They take advantage of students by coercing them into opening up lines of credit and then running up their debt. Traffickers may tell their victims the only way to pay off this debt is to engage in sexual acts for money. So definitely the hard truth there, but let's see here, it doesn't. There we go. So I talked a little bit about how traffickers operate, what the Blue campaign is. Now I'm going to go into some resources specific to tribal communities that are also specific to some other communities as well, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our resources. So in fiscal year 20, the Blue campaign created a How to Talk to Youth About Human Trafficking guide. Through research, we determined that youth are one of the most vulnerable groups to human trafficking. And to be quite honest with you, prevention is a new anti-trafficking goal for Blue Campaign since our creation. And this product is actually the first prevention resource that we launched. For this resource, we incorporated many rounds and levels of feedback and input from subject matter experts, survivors, and end users of the product to ensure that the information we put in there is relevant and actionable. It's also designed so that adults can adapt the information based on unique needs of the youth they work with. We started off for this resource, we started by hosting a series of roundtables to organizations that serve populations vulnerable to human trafficking to learn what needs exist in the field. And the youth was a continuing topic that was brought up. It was discussed at length as being particularly vulnerable to human trafficking. Through an analysis, we found that there were a number of resources for parents and teachers, but not necessarily for other adults who work with youth, such as mentors, camp counselors, etc. Existing resources that we found were more aligned with protection messages, which is, as I mentioned earlier, how to recognize and report, rather than prevention on how to educate someone on what human trafficking is so they know how to prevent it. Through this research, we determined that a guide with information about how to have proactive conversations with youth about exploitation and how to protect themselves was the best way that Blue Campaign could make an impact in this field. And up here, it talks about some of the things that are contained in this guide. All of the information, the guide is actually publicly available on our dhs.gov/Blue Campaign resources library. I'm not going to talk about everything, but I will go into a little bit of information on the do's and don'ts of talking to youth. So, human trafficking, we think, our youth, they're precious and whatnot, they're children. We don't really want to bring up terrible things with them, but it is important to talk about exploitation. Focus conversations on what it means to be taken advantage of, what it may look like, feel like, and even examples of exploitation, such as job offers that seem too good to be true, or online romantic relationships that move too fast. And one of the don'ts tagged with this is not to use crime-specific language. The term human trafficking may not resonate with youth, and they may even tune out from the conversations using too much crime-specific language. Another piece here is to talk about protective factors. Conversations should focus on how youth can protect themselves and look out for their friends and peers. Encourage youth to recognize what they are good at, their future goals, and the value they bring to friends, family, and the community. Don't talk about risk factors. Many times youth may not have any control over the risk factors they are affected by, well, albeit whether it's poverty or class and whatnot. Many times youth focusing discussions on risk factors may make youth feel singled out, vulnerable, and unable to protect themselves. So it's all about empowering here, using empowering language. And these are things you can do on tribal communities as well. Use language that focuses on highlighting the strengths of the youth you work with and emphasizes they are in control of their own decisions, especially when presented with opportunities that may seem too good to be true. We don't want to use victimizing language that invokes fear or highlights weaknesses. We want to focus on the positive. And again, to use language that resonates with youth. By interacting with youth regularly, people are likely familiar with the types of language they use in their everyday conversations. Use casual language that you feel comfortable with and that the youth will connect with. And the last one here, I'm not going to go too into the weeds. I'm talking a lot here about this, but the entire guide is on our website and is very robust. Express that you care and are concerned about their safety. If a youth shares information with you about an exploitive situation they may be experiencing, start by listening to them and letting them know you care about what they are going through. This is very important, especially when we're dealing with youth. They could have experienced something really bad, and it's important to not question their situation and let the professionals who are trained in trauma and survivor-informed responses to ask specific questions about their situation. Sorry about that. Okay, so a couple years ago in 2018, the Blue Campaign, we actually worked with representatives across the country and tribal communities to develop a poster series that addresses human trafficking. We worked with our extensive network of survivors to have a survivor from the tribal community present for the entire, she was there for the entire photo shoot to ensure that the pictures were representative of Native settings. The posters have been downloaded over 5,000 times. In addition to this, we also included a Facebook Live hosted in fiscal year 19 that obtained over 8,000 views. And that Facebook Live included participation from the National Indian Gaming Commission, the National Center for Victims of Crime, and the Tribal Gaming Protection Network. In addition to the Facebook Live, we also did a Twitter chat with the Center for Native American Youth in November. That was just to educate folks on what human trafficking is. These posters were created as a part of a larger effort to address human trafficking that's occurring in this setting. So in 2018, another important thing that we did was we created a webinar on human trafficking in tribal communities. And the webinar is up here. I'm not going to play the entire thing, but you can watch it on our website if you're interested. It includes a portion from the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and Jerry Muma, who is the Executive Director of Innovation Human Trafficking Collaborative and is also a Native American human trafficking survivor herself. She covers how this crime uniquely impacts Native Americans. There's a lot of misconceptions out there that traffickers can get away with it on tribal communities, and that's not the case. You know, we want to go after traffickers regardless of where they're operating. The webinar also provides information on how to better recognize and respond to Native American victims of human trafficking. These trainings are available at our website, and happy to provide that link after this session. So we are in the works of not just in 2018, but we're also doing stuff now. This fall, we will be launching a training devoted to helping individuals recognize potential grooming tactics and make informed choices to protect themselves from victimization. The training is called Choices. It's prevention focused, and it provides core knowledge that ensures all targeted and vulnerable populations understand behaviors traffickers use to recruit and entice victims, and that includes the tribal communities. It's an interactive web-based simulation using text message conversation where a participant can choose how to respond to incoming messages from a potential trafficker. It's very important, and this type of training is incredibly relevant as well. We did consult with human trafficking survivors to make sure that those texts were accurate when it comes to addressing the situation. So I will talk about this advertising pilot. I'm going to do another quick pause to see if there are any questions on anything I talked about so far. Excellent. Okay. Well, again, there'll be another opportunity for questions at the end. So recently, Blue Campaign, like I mentioned, we create content specific to different audiences. And this year, we are actually piloting a campaign in New Mexico with the goal of reaching Native American adults on human trafficking. And so this is a dual tactic digital advertising campaign that actually started on August 2nd, and it'll run for 2 months into September. We actually collaborated with 2 local NGOs in New Mexico, the LifeLink and the New Mexico Dream Center, with the goal of reaching Native American, I said adults, but I meant we're looking to reach Native American individuals to include youth and adults who may be victims of survivors of human trafficking. And we want to connect them with these local service providers in New Mexico and Albuquerque. We already got positive feedback from one of these organizations that it's significantly increasing their website traffic, specifically in areas where there are tribal communities. When we partner with local service providers like this, it provides Blue Campaign with credibility, especially with our messaging, the actionable on-the-ground response support to requests for assistance, and it also allows our campaign to collect additional layers of data to gauge impact on our digital advertising efforts. And what I mean by that is evaluating volume of incoming support requests before, during, and after the campaign. So if you're not familiar with social media, some of the advertising tactics that we use for this campaign is Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, but will all be leveraged to reach and engage Native American individuals in New Mexico and Albuquerque with information about human trafficking and how to access support services. We also, as a part of these ads, include what's called the click-to-call ads, which is when let's say you search human trafficking on Google, a couple ads will come up, and right at the top, it'll say, if you're a victim of human trafficking, call this number. And the number that we have linked is the LifeLink Get Free hotline and also the New Mexico Dream Center hotline, which will allow individuals who search human trafficking related topics in the search bar to click and get directly into a phone call to report human trafficking or to seek survivor support in their area. We're very excited to evaluate the impact of this campaign once it's wrapped up, and potentially launch it on a much larger scale and in different communities, partnering with different local NGOs. So one thing I mentioned before, Blue Campaign, we are a very public-facing program within the department. We do several different types of engagements. We're consistently looking for ways to spread awareness of human trafficking through these engagements. One thing I didn't talk about earlier, but important, is that January is National Human Trafficking Prevention Month. And we have a very robust social media effort during that month. January 11th, the Blue Campaign coined as Wear Blue Day, where we encourage all of our partners and stakeholders to wear blue in showing your support of combating human trafficking. Other things that we will participate in are conference presentations, trainings, exhibitor booths. In this picture right here, I'm actually right there next to the man in the gray jacket. I traveled a couple weeks ago to New Orleans and did a booth at the Airborne Public Safety Association, educating the aviation industry on human trafficking indicators and what to look out for in their field. We also do webinars like the one I'm doing right now, social media events, Facebook Live I talked about earlier, as well as Twitter chats. And of course, we'll do congressional briefings for different members of Congress to educate them on what we're doing with, with our projects and how we are reaching their different constituents. The one thing I will mention about some of the most impactful engagements that Blue Campaign does is always the ones that include survivor participation. So with just about everything we do, we engage with survivors. And even myself, I'm always surprised. I'm always surprised when I hear from survivors, because it never ceases to amaze me how incredible some of their stories are, and how they're now out of the situation and they're supporting us and helping us make sure our content is relevant. And it's not just me. Whenever we do presentations and we loop in survivors, the engagement is very high, and we usually get a very, very big turnout, and it's very impactful. If you haven't heard from survivors, I would encourage you to take a look at that. And in September, we will actually be launching some social media ads that include survivor quotes. And it won't be directed to any specific survivor, but they are real quotes, and it is very eye-opening. Things like, I went through multiple airports, and there were many, or multiple hotels, and there were many employees that kind of could have saw what was going on and didn't say anything. And those are the things that motivate me to do these trainings and educate different folks on what to look out for and how to spread awareness among their communities. And again, everything up here are things that we can do with your tribal communities to help victims and survivors of human trafficking, and also to protect those who are vulnerable. So we will tailor our content for specific audiences. For my aviation training, I focus on the indicators specific towards transportation. And for this, we focus on the efforts that we're working on to engage tribal communities. So if you are interested in leveraging DHS for a webinar, conference, anything like that, there is a DHS speaker request form, and it's in the link in this PowerPoint. You can fill out that form and email the completed form to bluecampaign@hq.dhs.gov. You can also email that Blue Campaign email any questions that you have regarding anything, and we'll get back to you and set up a call if we would like to talk a little bit more. So talked a little bit about Blue Campaign, some of our resources for tribal communities. Now I'm going to get into reporting human trafficking. And it can be a little confusing to see a whole bunch of different numbers, but I'm going to break it down and make it very simple for how the Blue Campaign addresses this. So when we talk about reporting human trafficking, we always want to caveat it with follow your organization's internal reporting protocols. So sometimes companies and organizations have an internal security desk, or they want you to report internally before it goes out to law enforcement or an NGO. And we definitely recommend keeping within those limits. The other thing I'll say is do not at any time attempt to confront or to confront a suspected trafficker or alert them to your suspicions. And this is a big one. Sometimes people ask if they should take pictures or videos, and my answer to that would be no, because that would alert the trafficker to your suspicions. Not only can it put yourself in danger, but it could also put the victim in more danger if they get caught trying to seek help. And so the responses definitely need to be victim-centered and trauma-informed. So if there is an immediate emergency, if someone is coming to you, they say they're a victim, it's very not likely for that to happen. But if that does happen, or if someone's in immediate danger with violence, obviously call 911 or local authorities to get that situated. If you see something suspicious, if you see suspicious activity, call the Homeland Security Investigations tip line. That is that number right there, 1-866-347-2423. That is a 24/7 tip line. Homeland Security Investigations, I talked about earlier, they investigate human trafficking among other crimes, and they will look into it to see if it is human trafficking. And if it is, they'll open up a case and go after those traffickers while assisting victims. If someone is a victim and needs help, or knows a victim who needs help, you can contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 1-888-373-7888. That is also 24/7, 7 days a week. You can text it, you can chat it, you can call it. It's good to have this resource for victims because they may not always feel comfortable contacting law enforcement. And the National Human Trafficking Hotline is a non-law enforcement. They're operated by players called NGO currently. Called Polaris currently. They're an NGO. And they can refer tips to law enforcement, but they are primarily for service providers. And they've got a network of NGOs across the entire United States getting folks the help that they need. And when we're talking about youth specifically and missing and exploited youth, this last bullet here explains that number right there. And there's also a cyber tip line to report suspected child sex trafficking. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, if you're not already familiar, is a super important organization. They are responsible for looking into missing and exploited children, and oftentimes that does include child sex trafficking. I believe the report came out that in fiscal year 20 alone, they received over 20 million reports of online exploitation, and I know thousands of those were linked to sex trafficking. And they do an incredible job working with several federal law enforcement agencies and local law enforcement agencies to track children and get them back to their families and recover them. So I'm a little bit ahead of time, but that basically wraps up the main portion of my presentation. So I will pause here, see if there are any questions.
I don't see any questions rolling in yet, so I'm going to throw one in that I had as you were going through. You were talking about the advertising campaign happening in New Mexico that started at the beginning of August. And I'm wondering, I may have missed it if you did say it, and I apologize if that's the case. What is the majority of advertising? What are you guys utilizing? Are you utilizing billboards? Are you utilizing radio? Like, what is that looking like on the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we utilize the social media channels that we have, and we'll do paid digital ads that'll be targeted to a specific location. And so we'll have pre-approved content with messaging that goes into those ads, and as well as pictures. And it'll be posted on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and with New Mexico, I believe we're also doing some radio ads as well. And so it really depends on what location we're talking about, whether we do billboards or not. We've strayed away from billboards just because it's a little bit harder to track how effective they are, other than how many people passed by it. But yeah, it really does depend on our target audience. And the one thing we're also working on now with, it hasn't been launched yet, but we're working on a deterrence campaign. And that campaign will include ads focused on targeting potential buyers and traffickers with deterrence-focused messaging, and those will be launched on those social media channels as well. But also, on dating site apps. And so like that's another interesting way that traffickers use to groom potential victims.
Sure. So you'll be able then to aggregate the data in terms of where the most focus is and via the social media, whether it's the dating apps or Facebook and Instagram, to see where the primary focus is for either traffickers or victims, where they tend to gravitate.
Yeah, well, we can get engagement rate data to see how many people are looking at our ads, how many people are clicking on it.
Yeah.
With the deterrence campaign, we're linking to a specific training, so we can see how many people click that link to go to the training. And when I talk about click to call ads, which is when someone, the click to call ads are on Google. So if you type in like human trafficking on Google, ad will pop up and say, if you're a human trafficking victim, or if you see something suspicious, call this number. And we can track the number of calls that come in and how long they last. And then we partner with the NGOs to see if that call resulted in an actionable case of human trafficking or something else. And sometimes it's other things, but still useful.
So is that one more question on this? I just am very interested and curious about this campaign. Is that something that once you guys are finished with it, is it going to be publicized? You're going to share that data? Are you going to try to do that in another portion of the country if it's successful?
Yeah, it definitely depends on the outcome. I'm hoping usually with click to call campaigns, they don't generate too many calls, but for me, a successful call is worth it. And for privacy reasons, we usually don't publicize the click to call data and that sort of thing. We might aggregate it and put it in a congressional report when the time is due, and then that congressional report is usually public. Right. But I believe. And then what was the second part of your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if it does turn out to be a successful campaign, are you guys thinking about doing it in other parts of the country?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And so we actually, Blue Campaign, we actually run a nationwide click to call campaign. So that's going on everywhere. And it's like every time someone types in human trafficking, usually it links to the Polaris National Human Trafficking Hotline number. But these localized campaigns, definitely I see us doing. We might do a couple more pilots in different areas before we launch a nationwide one. But it's contingent upon our partnerships with the NGOs. And sometimes those require a little time to set up. But we've had a lot of great partnerships with those two NGOs I talked about. And also Polaris is a great partner with us.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I again, please feel free to ask questions, you guys. I certainly don't want to dominate this end of Michael's presentation here, but I was just really excited to see the aviation partnership you guys have going on. I mean, it just makes good common sense, right? To partner with people that are transportation based to the signs of what human trafficking looks like.
Yeah, the aviation program is something I've been working on ever since I joined the Blue Campaign, and it's come a very long way. We were primarily focused on the airlines when it was started in 2012, and in October of 2018 we expanded it to our first airport, because it's not just the flight attendants that could see the stuff going on; it's also the ticket counter agent, the gate agent, the janitor, like just your everyday people. And we 2 weeks ago we actually filmed two new scenarios, one occurring at a large commercial airport and one at a small regional airport. And so we've got like large airports partners, and the new training will probably be available to those partners in a couple months. Probably Q1 of fiscal year 22 is our goal. And so, we've got a training for in-flight staff, and now we have one coming up for ground staff. And again, the survivor conversations that I've had have been the most impactful. Like one survivor, we did a webinar last week, and she said that in her situation alone, she was transported between 43 different cities and 13 different states, all via commercial air. And these are the flights that we're all going on. It's happening right in front of us. And like one thing she told us was that you wouldn't really be able to see it if you didn't know what to look out for. She was wearing normal clothes. She wasn't bruised or anything, or if she was bruised, the trafficker would be smart enough to bruise her in an area that wasn't visibly seen. But the indicators are there. And so there are things that to look out for. I could talk to you all day about that.
Yeah, well, and it's, it seems to be the case just across the board. It's the awareness piece and, doing this work and folks like us that are just really enmeshed in it. It's like, well, of course, but I just spoke with somebody yesterday, actually, and you forget how, for lack of a better word, oblivious or naive folks are to the realities of what's happening just under the surface, so getting that awareness out there as much as we possibly can quickly with the prevention and the what to do right after it, right? So it doesn't worsen the situation. That I mean, you have to be careful of the steps by certainly. So it's just great to see what's happening at a governmental level. So I really appreciate your presentation today, Michael. And if there's anybody that does have questions, now's the time. Yeah, he did finish early for us, but that is a-okay because there's a lot packed in there. And I don't think I mentioned it at the beginning, but Michael will be sharing his presentation. So we will send that out after our recording is optimized, and we can send out the recording of the session as well as his PDF of his PowerPoint. And he's also going to organize any links that he mentioned and share that with us as well. And it looks like there is a question that popped up. Are there anti-trafficking initiatives for tribal hotel and casinos? Is the question that popped up.
Yeah, so Blue Campaign, we have a hospitality toolkit that's available on our website. It's applicable to hotels that are on tribal lands as well as other hotels. But in addition to that, we are also in the process of working with the Department of Treasury and the U.S. Department of Justice to create a webinar that we're going to be able to record. And that webinar will specifically be tailored for tribal casinos because that's a big area where human trafficking can happen. And so it's something we've been working with them on, and we are going to be, we're working to finalize it next fiscal year. So as soon as that's done, you guys will be the first to know.
Great question. Yeah, thank you. All right. Anyone else have any thoughts, comments, or questions? I believe, Michael, there you did put an email on there. So if there are questions that come up after the fact, is there a good email that you'd be willing to share, or?
Yeah, I can share I'm fine with sharing my email. I'll put it in the chat here.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's always nice. I'm a reflector for, I don't know how many folks are like that, but I have to walk away, integrate the content, and then I come up with all kinds of thoughts. So there, Michael added his email if anyone wants to reach out or has thoughts that pop up. And a question did come in. How do you implement missing and murdered Indigenous women in your campaign?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And there's a very large effort to address missing and murdered Indigenous women at the federal level within DHS and other agencies as well. And as you probably know, missing and murdered Indigenous women, it doesn't always involve human trafficking, but there are definitely layovers when it comes to that. And one of the things that I didn't really get into in the presentation, but I'll talk about now, is that the Blue Campaign is a part of the Senior Policy Operating Group, the President's Interagency Task Force Senior Policy Operating Group, which is essentially executive level effort from all 15 executive branch agencies to address human trafficking at a federal level. And there's different subcommittees. And one of the teams on that SPOG is focused on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we sit on those committees. We engage with the subject matter experts that focus on that. And there are different ad hoc working groups that pop up that are related to that. And there was one in 2019, 2018, I believe, that I sat on. It was the ad hoc working group to address human trafficking with missing and murdered Indigenous women on tribal lands. And so there are different initiatives that pop up, and that is definitely included in our outreach and awareness. And the other main piece I'll add to that is the survivor engagement that we do. When we work on Native American specific content, we leverage different survivors, but also survivors who are members of tribes themselves. And one of the airport scenarios that we filmed, she is from Minnesota, actually, which I believe is where where you guys are, yeah. And also the poster series was informed by a different Native American human trafficking survivor. So, I'm not, a lot of our staff aren't Native American ourselves, but we rely heavily on the subject matter expertise of our federal government colleagues, as well as the human trafficking survivors.
Thank you. That is a great question, and close to the hearts of many people, I would imagine, on today's webinar. Okay, well, being mindful of time here, we're getting close to the noon hour, well, central noon hour. Thank you again, Michael, for joining us, and thank you to everyone on the call today. Very informative. And again, if you do have follow-up questions or things that pop into your head after you leave the session today, please feel free. You can email Mending the Sacred Hoop. You can go to our website and find us there. You can email Michael if anything specific comes up there. Thanks again, everyone. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Keep an eye out in your email for the recording and Michael's PowerPoint and our remainder of our sessions for our webinar series. Have a wonderful afternoon all.